Hi, everyone. I'm Abbey Wick from North Dakota State University. I'm the Extension Soil Health Specialist here and also an Associate Professor. I primarily work with soil health in the Northern Plains. I like to think that we're trying to erase that border between North and South Dakota and looking at our systems jointly because there's so much great information coming from both states. So I was asked to share a little bit on finding, your approach for cover crops, or in general cover crops in corn and soybean, and also after wheat. But I did want to talk about your approach because I think cover crops are highly customized. And I think that, based on your goals, your system, your logistics, we want to find the best fit for your operation. So we will dive right in. So the first thing to do with cover crops, if you're thinking about using them, or even if you've been using cover crops for a while and you just want to reassess your system, is to think about ask yourself, what is your goal? And sometimes that may be reducing erosion. I hear that goal quite often because as we all know, in the Northern Plains, the wind blows, the soils move. We want to keep them in place as our primary investment on the farm. Managing moisture can be a goal, whether it's too much moisture and you need to use it up, or conserve moisture, like we've had some droughts in this area this past year. So those are a couple goals that I come across quite often. And then there's the general ones that, breaking up compaction. So are you going to use something like a radish to do that? Or improving seed bed. I love this picture because it shows a field that was moldboard plowed on the right-hand side. And then over on the left, this is a soil that had transitioned to no-till. And so you can see this massive difference in the way those soils look. And improving that seed bed means better seed to soil contact, better crop establishment, and potentially better yields. So if we're looking at also another reason maybe to keep a live root in your soil for as long as you possibly can. So a living soil. And this is where the earthworms come back into play. And maybe you want earthworms so they can create these channels from the surface down deep into the soil profile for water movement. Or you want the nutrient dense channels that those earthworms create for your roots to grow into. Or you want bacteria and fungal hyphae to help your crops do what they need to do and get the nutrients they need. So there are multiple reasons, and really, these certainly aren't all the reasons. There are other ones that may be more personal to your operation. But really thinking about what your goal is and how cover crops are going to help you achieve that goal is pretty critical. But the first things first, and this is a lesson I learned from the farmers I work with, is you better figure out residue management first. So if you've talked with Anthony Bly from SDSU, he's mentioned that you better be thinking the year before on how you're managing that residue before you go into reduced till systems, before you start using cover crops. Before you embark on any of these soil health practices, is getting that residue management right. That means an even spread of residue behind the combine. It means, if you're harvesting corn, turning off the chopping head and leaving those stalks standing, as you can see in this picture. That really helps that cover crop between those rows grow and flourish. It also keeps that residue off the ground and standing up so that it's easier to plant into the following year. This is an example of, it seems strange to have these two approaches used in one field, but these farmers I work with, they're often trying different things. And I think in this situation, they have a stripper header, and then they also have they're straight cutting their wheat. So they had to get this field done. So part of it got the stripper head, the other part got straight cut. And you can see in the stripper head, you're leaving that residue off of the ground in a standing form. And if you straight cut it, a little bit more lays down on the ground as well. So I think, a lot of the benefits of leaving that residue standing as well are to get an even snow catch across that field, to avoid bunching up of residue and low spots in the field that could cause issues with planting. Just leaving a residue in place as much as you can and getting an even spread behind the combine is pretty critical when starting any soil health practice. And especially knowing that cover crops aren't going to fix poor residue management. You just need to keep that in your mind as you move forward. So let's start with, a cover crop after small grains. I think, in North Dakota, sometimes we have enough time to seed a cover crop after a small grain. And South Dakota being further south, I think you have probably more of an opportunity. But you need to think about, again, what is your goal? And in identifying that goal, you also need to ask yourself, what are the conditions at the time of seeding the cover crop? Is it too dry? Are you going to get the moisture you need? Is it too late? Do you have enough time? Asking yourself those questions so that you can make the best economic decision is the way to go for this approach. But I want to show you two systems, one on the left where we have a stripped field, but it also has the volunteer small grain coming back under there as a cover crop. That's totally fine. We don't have to be diverse. If this is what helps us achieve our goal of maybe moisture management or living root in the soil, then that's a great approach and go with it. On the right-hand side, we have where the volunteer small grain was terminated and then a cover crop seeded. And in this case, it includes winter rye or cereal rye, which will grow again in the spring. And so they terminated that volunteer to make sure they had plenty of opportunity for what they seeded to grow and establish and do well. But again, two different goals on these fields, two different approaches, which clearly are different in the cost associated with them, but both hopefully achieving what those farmers wanted to on those fields. So here's another example. This is a stripped field, stripped wheat. And you can see this farmer, he looks at volunteer wheat as a cover crop, but he also wants that overwintering factor. So he adds in some cereal rye, or a lot of people call that winter rye. He seeds a pretty low rate of radish, some peas, because he grows peas. So he has them on hand. And his mix ends up costing him less than $10 an acre. And I think in a lot of cases, unless you're going to graze this cover crop, thinking about keeping those seed costs minimal is a good idea, because we also need to consider that it costs him money to go out and seed this cover crop in this field as well. One tip from this farmer would be that if you're using cereal rye and you farm high clay soils and also sandy soils, and you're thinking about the crop you're going to next year, if you want to plant green with soybean into the rye, adjusting those cereal rye rates that you're using can be really helpful. So on his higher clay soils, he's using 32 pounds of rye. And on his sandier textured soils, he's only using 10 pounds of rye, or he's not using rye at all. And he's using oats or the volunteer coming back. So knowing that you don't have to be locked into a specific rate, but picking the best rate for your soil texture, for your operation. In his case, I'd ask him, what's with the 32 pounds? You know, why would you choose 32? Why not 30, 35, you know, something like that. And 32 was what made his drill run well. So really it's customizing these, figuring out what works for your equipment and for your soil types. Here's another example where this was another cover crop that was seeded. This is on a high clay soil. This farmer really wanted the radish and the dwarf Essex rapeseed that's in the mix, and the flax to express themselves or show up in that mix. So he did terminate his volunteer wheat. He had plenty of time this year. I remember this year was a long fall, plenty of opportunity for growth. And so that's what he did. You can see that he straight cut his wheat, so it's not using a stripper head. And this is just a little bit different system to give some variety to what we're talking about. If we're talking about terminating the volunteer wheat or not terminating it, these pictures are from actually a side-by-side with just a trail basically separating the two fields. And on the left-hand side, you can see where this farmer did terminate the volunteer small grain coming back. And so in this mix, it was a fairly expensive mix because it was intended to be grazed. It has, I think there's faba bean, there's probably some peas, radish, turnips, flax in this mix. So when you get an expensive mix, you kind of want to think about, how are you going to get that mix to do the best it possibly can? And in this case, it was probably to terminate that small grain that's coming back. On the right-hand side of the screen, this field literally, like I said, is across the trail, and same mix, but that volunteer was allowed to come back. They didn't have time to spray it before they seeded. So it looks totally different when you decide to terminate or not terminate. Now, in a lot of cases, you may not have time to terminate, let that regrowth happen and then terminate the volunteer. But that just means that as you're combining a field, just make sure you're following that combine with a drill to get it seeded. So the timing on this is pretty important. But you don't have to seed the whole field to cover crops. This is another lesson I learned from a farmer who is right on the North Dakota, South Dakota border, Joe Brecker. And this isn't his field. This is one of the fields that I have a large research project on. But I wanted to try Biostrip till. And the idea on that is to possibly reduce your costs for cover crop seed, get maybe a planter in there to seed it so you can get some residue management and some of that pushed away as you're seeding it. and to target those strips where you're going to plant your crop the following year. So in this mix, we chose radish, flax, and faba bean. And I'll show you in a second why we chose the faba bean. But we spent less than 20 bucks an acre on this mix. We had that residue management or movement prior to seeding, because we used a customized unit, but you could use a planter or something for this and just seed radish if you want. But to get something to push that residue aside, because this is our third year in no-till on this field, and I was a little nervous about all the residue. So that's what we chose to do on this field. And let me show you why we chose faba bean in this mix. So here, these dark strips aren't tillage strips, and it's not because the soil was disturbed. This is actually faba bean that has winter killed, or it got cold enough that it froze. And this is the color of that residue. So we're trying to create these darker strips that will warm up a little bit faster, hopefully similar to what it would in a conventional till system or a strip till system where you're mechanically disturbing that soil, but without the investment in a strip till machine or the disturbance associated with it. So just, trying to do a different approach to get the same result. So this is one example of how you could kind of customize the use of cover crops after wheat harvest. Another thing you could do, this is again a harvested wheat field where we came in, well, I shouldn't say we, this was a farmer's field again, where he came in and seeded cereal rye on, I think this was on 30-inch row spacing, and he was going to come in between those rye rows. So not seeding on the row like we were in the previous examples, but seeding between the rows with sunflowers. So kind of doing the reverse where they're concentrating the cover crops between the crop rows. With something that's going to overwinter like cereal rye, but trying to get away from that competition within that planting zone of the following crop. Now, I think this could be done with sunflowers. I think that's pretty low risk. Potentially, if you felt like you had to use rye before corn, which is not something we recommend, getting it away from that strip where you're planting the corn is going to be a good idea. So if you have to use rye before corn, or you really want to use rye before corn, I just wouldn't solid seed it. I would put it in these kind of strips and then go right between them with your cash crop. So if we're talking about corn now, there's different options for cover crops in corn. I think in the Northern Plains, it's not really an option for us to come in and seed a cover crop after harvest. Maybe as you get further south into South Dakota, it may be more of an option. For us in North Dakota, I can't imagine, unless it's a year like it was this year, being able to go in and seed something like cereal rye after corn harvest. So we're looking at interseeding, getting that cover crop in between the corn rows while the corn is growing, or also flying it on with an airplane. And you can see how these two different systems look using those two approaches. So let's talk a little bit more about those. Interseeding is where, this piece of specialized equipment we have is a twin row unit by Fargo Air, or also kind of Amity, and looking at, seeding that cover crop in a twin row between the corn. You can actually see this year that we did this. It was very, very dry. All the corn leaves were curling already. It was very dry when we were doing this. So that's a question you have to ask yourself is there going to be enough moisture to get this cover crop going? We did it anyways, because we do the research and we like to be the ones to make a mistake if we do. But getting that seed to soil contact, especially in this dry condition, we felt was really important to the establishment of the cover crop. And we got a good catch. We did rye and radish in this, and you can see here is mid-season between the corn rows. This was a transitional year from conventional till into no-till in the Red River Valley, so high clay soils. You can see some of the cracking that's there because it is so dry, but we did get a good catch of that cover crop. But not enough that it's competing with the corn. So if we look at where the corn wasn't established, but we had seeded the cover crop as we were going into it, the cover crops got fairly large outside of the corn rows. Within them, we kept that cover crop fairly small because of the shading and the competition from the corn, where we could get it established. So it's there, but not compete with the corn. Post-harvest, I think this always looks beautiful to me, seeing the brown residue with the green cover crops. This was right after harvest. Again, notice the standing corn stalks. getting the residue off the ground. That way it doesn't smother the cover crop. It also isn't laying on the ground to hold in all that moisture that may come over the winter or later in the season. And that cover crop is just starting to grow. And then if you give it a chance to grow and you look at it right before before winter really kicks in and you don't want to be out in the field, this is what it looks like. The snow is being caught between all those standing corn stalks. It's insulating the soil. That cover crop is still green underneath. And we got fairly large radish in this system in doing that. So I think another really great approach. I don't want to just talk about successes though. I think there's things we can learn from failures. And one of the things in this approach is that if you're on 22-inch corn rows or 20s, or you have a later maturing corn and it's shading out the between rows more, that cover crop is really difficult to establish. So this may not be the approach for you if that's the case. We want to make sure that if you're investing money in something that you're going to get what you want out of it. I've also heard a lot of issues with crickets. So farmers that are either seeding it and flying it on are having really difficult times getting the cover crops established because crickets will come in and eat the seeds and then they have nothing. And some farmers have tried flying on cover crops or seeding them twice or 3 times in a season and just not getting the establishment they want. So there is a risk involved with interseeding a cover crop into a cash crop. Another way to get that cover crop in there is to broadcast. And this is a piece of equipment that a farmer over by Jamestown, North Dakota uses. He has 2 tanks on it so he can spread fertilizer and then also rye as a cover crop seed onto his fields. So he's done that fairly successfully. The stand is quite different from when you would seed it. But if you look at what he's doing, this is typically what his field looks like at the next spring. He's got a really good stand of rye out there. He's also variable rating the rye as he goes across the field. So he will go 10 pounds on the higher parts of the field or the sandier parts. And then he'll go heavier, like 60 pounds, which is the bottom right-hand corner on the lower parts of the field. Now he's just doing this, switching it on and, changing the rate, as he's in the equipment, but you probably could build some maps for this or something to variable rate your cover crop as you change your fertilizer rates across the field too. So I like that approach. I like that we're seeing in one field that it's not treated the same because as soil types change, conditions change, what you need out of a cover crop is going to change too. Flying in with an airplane is always another option, and that may be probably the cheapest option in a lot of cases if you have access to somebody that can fly on cover crops for you. But this one is pretty tricky and it's usually done at tasseling. So it's later in the season. One of the things I do like about going earlier is that if you can get those cover crops established in areas where your corn crop is poor, no field is perfect. So if you have a part of the field that's a drown out or it just didn't establish well, at least the cover crops there are competing with the weeds. When you're going on late in the season like this, you likely already have those weeds in those areas that didn't have a good stand. But this is an option and it does work very well for some farmers. Here on the left, we have how that rye looks after a month. And then April the following year, you might think in the fall that it wasn't worth it. You didn't get a good stand. Why did I do this? But when you look at it the next spring, you might see a different story where the rye has grown, it's doing its thing, using moisture, managing moisture for you in the spring. You also might look across the field and see that the low parts of the field, maybe that rye looks better that you flew on versus the tops of the field or the high points in the field. And as farmers, I think, you look across the field and you want it uniform, right? You're used to a uniform crop. You want things to be the same. And honestly, having rye doing well and growing in a lower part of the field where it's wetter, typically, is a good thing, and not having it growing on the hilltop is probably good because you don't have moisture to spare up there. So thinking of it with a different perspective is a good idea to make sure that before you determine whether something is a success or not, follow it through to the next spring, and then try to see if it's achieving your goal. Rain is so critical when flying on a cover crop like cereal rye or anything else that's small seeded. Here's an example, literally one step across the field, where it was the cover crop, the rye was flown on before 1 inch rain. They had to stop flying it on. They came back the next day after that 1 inch rain, and look at the difference in establishment. So rain is so critical when you're flying on a cover crop, and you just need to keep that in mind and set your expectations based on that fact. Now, if we look at soybean, this is sometimes I think of it as the most difficult crop to use a cover crop in, but then sometimes it's easiest. So again, find out what is your goal. Do you want something growing early in the season to manage moisture? Do you want something growing post-harvest that can hold the residue that's there in place or reduce erosion after a fairly low residue crop? How are you going to get this established, and what is the best timing for you in this field? So there's options, there's a couple different options, and we'll set our expectations based on what we're doing. So planting green, great option, especially if you're in a high clay soil. If you have excess moisture, you have concerns about high clay soils and trafficability in the spring, planting green is a great way to gain trafficability, to be able to go into a reduced till system, to make that transition. It's fairly inexpensive, and most farmers that are using this approach have a very good experience with it. However, if you're on a sandier soil or you're in drought conditions, you better be watching that rye in the spring to make sure it doesn't use too much moisture. Because if you use too much moisture, your soybean you plant into it could be a growth stage behind at harvest. For us in North Dakota, we can't afford that. We need as much production as we can get. South Dakota, maybe it's a little different story and you could get away with it, but manage that cover crop. Rye is not something you just plant and forget. You need to manage it like you would anything else on the farm. But here's an example of moisture content if we're looking to manage moisture in the spring with rye. On the left, we have that soil is saturated, 50% moisture saturated for a soil. And that's just with the residue alone, that there's nothing managing that moisture. There's some infiltration, but there's nothing moving moisture out through transpiration in the spring. However, when you have the rye in that system, even if it's not very big, you're still cutting that moisture in half. So I think that's really important to think about, having that extra tool there that you can control. You can terminate it if it's using too much moisture. You can let it grow if you have excess. There's a lot of flexibility in that system. And then here's right next to it a bare field where you can actually see behind here, these little pink dots are the seed that are exposed from the erosion on this field, and it has no moisture at the surface. So those seeds are not going to germinate. And that system, we never went back to look at yields on it, but I would take either of the left ones with at saturation, or the middle ground, the sweet spot with the rye and the residue. So just something to keep in mind, and that's why we're using rye, is to use some of that moisture, but it does use it very quickly. So that's why you need to manage it and watch it. As far as yields coming off of this, when you're planting soybean into rye, I think it's pretty consistent between North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, any of those places where if you're planting soybean into rye, it's a great fit. It's a great fit. So here, this is within a field. We had 6 strips where we had rye, 6 strips where we didn't have rye, same yields, same soybean yields. Some people may look at these yields and be like, oh, that's terrible yields. This field is one of the worst fields I've probably ever worked on, as far as the clay content in it, the drainage, the issues with moisture. So this is a very challenging field, and approaching 40 bushel an acre is actually very, very good for this year on this field. And rye was a great tool to help do that. Here's another field on a sandier soil where the soybean were planted into cereal rye, and then it was rolled after planting. And it was sprayed and then rolled, and then the non-rye is on the right-hand side. And it's very difficult to visually see a difference. When the farmer combined this field, he did not see any yield difference either. So this is just a split field example, so there weren't stats or anything run on it, but just a farmer observation. You may also want to seed rye after soybean harvest, and this field that was done. You know, depending on what you're going to next, if you're going to go to corn, this is really risky, right? Because we don't plant corn into rye the following year. So this would be where you'd want to separate those out and do 30-inch row spacings where you can plant in between them. You certainly wouldn't want to put wheat on this field the following year. Say you forget you put rye out there, you plant wheat into it, now you've got a wheat rye mix. So you want to be really cautious with this approach. And sometimes in doing this, if it's late enough in the season and you're running your equipment out there to seed it and the discs are cutting up that soybean residue, and then we get right into winter and you get no growth on that cover crop, that winter annual cover crop, your field is actually going to be more susceptible to erosion than if you just left it and then seeded into it the next year. So just be aware of that and gauge, you know, the timing of when the crop comes off. Do you have enough time for that cover crop to grow? Is it worth it financially to do that? And then what are you going into the next year? If you're going to corn or wheat, using rye can be pretty risky. Maybe you want to use oats instead, that will winter kill, or you better be prepared to spray this rye out 14 days in advance of planting corn the following year. Again, great tool, very versatile, lots of options. I think in this field, it worked very well for what they were doing. They sprayed it out before they planted corn the next year. They had enough time and it worked well for them. But then there's also the option you could fly on a cover crop into a standing soybean crop. And in this case, again, high clay soil, using rye, going to corn the next year, farmer well aware that they're going to have to terminate that rye before planting, or the rates are going to be low enough that they're going to be on it and managing that system. This can be, flying a cover crop on can be done, right before leaf drop is usually when people talk about doing it. So you have to be watching the field to make sure you get that timing right. I've flown oats on into soybean later in the season and it hasn't worked out so well for me. So it's a pretty, you're throwing the dice on this one as to whether you're going to get a good stand or not. But it gives you lots of options after soybean harvest. In this case, they ran a strip till machine across it. Again, high clay soil, they're going to plant sunflowers into these strips. They got the rye away from where they're going to put the sunflowers in. To me, this is a beautiful field. You've got the cover crops growing between, they're well established. You have the strips for your crop the next year, your fertilizer's down. So that system worked very well. This field has very poor drainage. It's very wet. So this works for this farmer's goal of managing moisture, reducing erosion, and being able to get in that field the next year. This is my example from the Share Farm project I work on down in Morton, North Dakota. We flew on oats into soybean right before leaf drop, and you can kind of see a greenish tint on this field. So, the oats did establish, not very well, not what I was hoping for. But even that little bit of green material out there helped hold some of that residue in place and keep it from moving around the field. So you can see the standing corn stalks from the prior year, the soybeans sticking up. You've got a little bit of oats out there. This was how we were transitioning a high clay soil into reduced till, definitely using cover crops as our workhorse to make that possible, and give us a little bit of a safety net in doing these approaches. So we see there's options. You can plant a cover crop after wheat. This is what you might expect to get for growth. You can fly it on into soybean. This was a very, very good year for cover crops to grow when flown on into soybean. So you can see a great establishment here. I wouldn't expect this every year. That was just a phenomenal catch. And then interseeded into corn kind of falls somewhere in between, as far as growth. So I think there's plenty of options in our systems to make this work. We just have to kind of get creative and really customize it for what you want to do on your farm. So again, picking out those goals of what you want to achieve. And, I think we get asked the question sometimes too on how do I know this is working? Or, as I go through all this effort, it's exhausting. I'm planning more. I'm investing in these soil health practices. I'm learning all the time. How do I know this is working? And this is one of my favorite examples from a farm in the Wahpeton area. Again, high clay soils, and this is their field where they've been using, on the left-hand side, where they've been using no-till and cover crops and changing the rotation from corn and beans to include small grains and sunflowers and other crops. They harvested this soybean crop on this field in two-wheel drive. Okay, they loaded their trucks on the field. You can see very minimal rutting on that field at all. They had great trafficability. What they were doing was working. Right across the road, harvested the same day, tracks on that combine. Look at the tracks going across this field, how deep they were sinking their corn and soybean and sometimes wheat on this field. They couldn't load their trucks on the field. You could hardly walk out there. So the great thing about this farmer across the road with this system is he's very interested in learning how to do what's being done across the road. So this was a moment where this farmer got to see that what he was doing and the effort he was taking or making to do these practices was working. A couple of years later, this past 2019, he again got to see that what he was doing was working. So these fields are right across the road from each other. This one on the top is actually, it's a high clay soil, tiled ground, actually a easier soil type to farm than right across the road where he doesn't have any tile. He's been diversifying his rotation. He's been intensively using cover crops. And he drove me across this field and I was nervous. I wasn't sure how we were going to make it across the field, but we did. We barely sank into it. And again, he had gained that confidence in the practices that he was using to see that his combine that they run in two-wheel drive on these fields can do the job because of the practices they're using. Whereas you can throw a lot of different practices at it, or well, I guess maybe not a lot of practices, but you can throw tile drainage at it. You can get tracks for your combine. You can have those expenses and still, struggle to get that crop off. So looking for these signs of how these practices are working. And in this case, it is achieving his goal. His primary goal is moisture management and making sure you can get into the field in the spring and harvest that field in the fall. He is achieving those goals. And I think now he, with this system, he can navigate through and do the different, add in new practices and decide, really fine tune it. So I do want to say that learning happens faster with a network. Learning these things alone would never be possible. And I know in South Dakota, you guys have a great network of farmers and Extension and NRCS and the South Dakota Soil Health Coalition that can help you on this journey. You can also tap into our resources in North Dakota. I think that, I use your stuff a lot down there and using the NDSU soil health resources, making those connections, forming those relationships so that you have someone to call as you're making these transitions or using these practices can be critical, whether you're just starting out or sometimes you need to make those calls when you're, 40 years into it. So I think it's, building that network is really critical. And I encourage everyone that's doing this to not do it alone. There are plenty of people out there that are willing to help and willing to share. And I think that's what we see a lot in the soil health community. We do have a resource that most of those farmers pictured on that prior slide are part of the Soil Sense podcast. So that can be found at ndsoilsense.com. We're just coming into our 4th season. So you can hear some of those stories, get some of those experiences, hear the research in a way that's about collaboration and working together on these systems. So I hope that I've shed a little bit of light on some practices and ideas and gotten some people thinking, but just again, remember to customize it to your operation, to your goals, to what you want to do. Make the tool fit those goals. Don't try to fit your goals to the tool. And hopefully everybody has a lot of luck with what they're doing. And we hope to see you at some of our soil health events up here and what you're doing down in South Dakota as well. Thanks for joining me and talking about cover crops for your operation. And again, I'm Dr. Abbey Wick with North Dakota State University, the Extension Soil Health Specialist here. And I really appreciate being able to share what farmers are doing with you to get ideas for how cover crops could work for your operation. All of my contact information is available. If you search NDSU Soil Health, please reach out and ask any questions that you may have, or reach out to your SDSU folks down there, and hopefully we can get you the information that you need.